I still remember the sharp sting of disinfectant in the hospital air, the constant beeping of machines, the way the fluorescent lights hummed above me like restless ghosts. I'd been there for weeks, recovering from a stroke that nearly took my life. My mind was foggy, my hands trembled, but I clung to one comforting thought. Once I got out, I'd go home. My little blue house on Maple Lane, the one I'd painted myself, where every creak in the floor held a memory. That house wasn't just walls and windows. It was where my late husband and I built a life brick by brick, where laughter once filled the rooms, where birthdays, storms, and Sunday dinners gave shape to decades of love. I could picture it clearly, the ivy crawling up the porch railing, the smell of lavender from the garden, the ticking of the old clock by the fireplace. That was my peace, my anchor. So when my neighbor, Ruth, came to visit one afternoon, holding a folded newspaper in her trembling hands, I thought she'd bring flowers or gossip, not devastation. She hesitated at first. Her lips quivered, as if she didn't know how to begin. "Helen," she whispered, "I think you need to see this." She handed me the real estate section, and there, in bold, black print, was a photo of my house. My house. Listed for sale. Newly renovated, the ad said. Available for immediate possession. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a cruel coincidence. But the address, my address, was right there. My heart pounded so hard that the monitor beside me started to beep faster. Who did this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Ruth's eyes darted away. "Your nephew, Mark," she said softly. "He said you wouldn't be coming back." The words hit harder than the stroke ever did. Mark, my sister's boy, the one I'd helped raise, the one who used to call me Auntie Sunshine. I'd trusted him with everything. Finances, my mail, even my house keys while I was sick. And now, as I stared at that tiny printed image of my home, I felt something inside me fracture. The nurse tried to calm me down, but it was useless. My world was unraveling, and I couldn't even stand up to fight. That night, as rain pattered softly against the window, I made a silent vow. They may have sold my house, but they hadn't sold my spirit. And when I got out of that hospital, they'd learn that some surprises don't come wrapped in kindness. The morning I was discharged from the hospital, the world outside felt both familiar and foreign. The sun shone too brightly, the air carried a chill I didn't remember, and even the cab ride home felt endless. I'd imagined this moment for weeks, stepping back into my old life, smelling the faint scent of cinnamon that always lingered in my curtains. But as the car slowed down on Maple Lane, a hollow ache grew in my chest. The driver stopped. My house stood there, but it wasn't mine anymore. The white shutters had been replaced, the mailbox bore a different name, and my rose bushes had been uprooted. A strange car was parked in the driveway I once swept every Sunday morning. The laughter of children spilled from the backyard, but they were not the voices of my grandchildren. I sat there, frozen, unable to breathe. My hands gripped the purse in my lap until my knuckles turned white. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the driver asked gently. I managed a nod, even though the ground beneath me felt as though it had vanished. I didn't walk up to the house. I couldn't. Instead, I told the driver to take me to my sister's. She lived across town. Smaller home, kind heart, and the same trusting nature that had once blinded me. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, frail and trembling, she gasped, "Helen, what are you doing here?" "I thought Mark," the name sliced through. Check her sentence. I stepped inside before she could finish. "Mark sold my house," I said, my voice a low whisper, but each word carried weight. She went pale, covering her mouth. "No," she breathed. "He said you gave permission. That you—" "I what?" I interrupted. "I was lying in a hospital bed. I could barely hold a pen, let alone sign papers." She sank onto the couch, shock spreading across her face. "He told everyone you wanted to move into assisted living, that you were tired of taking care of the property. He even showed documents with your signature, my signature, forged." The realization burned through me like acid. Mark had done more than steal a home. He'd stolen my voice, my trust, and the last bit of dignity I had left. I asked my sister where he was now. She hesitated. "He's on vacation," she said finally. "He and his wife used the money from the sale to buy a cabin by the lake. Said they needed a break after taking care of you." That word, care, felt like mockery. I had trusted him to look after things while I recovered, and instead, He'd pocketed everything I'd built over 70 years. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. My mind churned through the past, the times I'd helped Mark through college, paid his rent when he lost his job, co-signed his first car loan. Every sacrifice replayed like an old movie, each scene ending the same way, me giving, and him taking. But this time, he'd gone too far. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I made a decision. I might be 73, but I wasn't helpless. I wasn't invisible. I'd built my life once, and I could fight for it again. Mark thought I was weak, that old age had made me soft. He'd learned that even the gentlest hearts can strike back when pushed to the edge. The next morning, I opened my sister's phone book and began dialing numbers. Lawyers, notaries, old friends from the neighborhood. One of them, Mr. Gordon, used to be a real estate broker. He owed me a favor from years ago. When I told him what happened, he grew silent for a moment and then said in a grave voice, "Helen, you're not going to like what I'm about to tell you, but it's worse than you think." When Mr. Gordon said those words, a chill went down my spine. I could hear him flipping through papers on the other end of the line. "Your house wasn't just sold once, Helen," he continued grimly. "It's been flipped, sold twice in the past month. Whoever handled this did it fast and quiet." I sat there in stunned silence, the phone trembling in my hand. "Flipped? How is that possible? The house wasn't even on the market." He sighed heavily. "That's the thing. Your son filed a power of attorney claiming you authorized him to act on your behalf. He used it to sell the property legally. Then, the buyer he worked with, likely a friend or investor, resold it within weeks for double the price." The room spun, my heartbeat thudded in my ears. Power of attorney. That single phrase meant he had turned my own trust into a weapon against me. I had signed a document months ago when I went into surgery, something the hospital required. I remembered Mark saying, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of the paperwork." I never thought he'd use it to gut my life savings. Mr. Gordon's tone softened. "Helen, you need to act fast. Once the papers are in order and money changes hands, it gets complicated. But I'll help however I can." When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long moment. Betrayal has a strange weight, heavier than grief, colder than anger. It sits in your chest and refuses to move. But under that weight, something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to let my own flesh and blood get away with this. I started by visiting the local records office. The clerk behind the counter looked at me curiously as I requested the property transfer documents. "Name?" she asked. "Helen Sanders," I replied, my voice firm. She handed me a printed packet. After a few minutes, when I saw Mark's signature beside mine, my stomach turned. He had forged it, and perfectly. There it was. Notarized, dated, witnessed. It looked official. Too official. "Who notarized this?" I asked. She pointed to a name. A woman named Carol Wilkins, licensed in the county. I knew that name. Carol had been Mark's friend from high school, someone who once worked with him at the local bank. My fingers clenched around the papers. It was all connected. Every signature, every stamp, every detail was part of his plan. When I left the building, the autumn wind cut through my coat. The city looked the same, cars passing, people walking dogs. But I felt as if I were in another world. My own son had orchestrated a theft that would have made strangers blush. That night, I sat with my sister in her kitchen. She listened, eyes wide, as I laid out everything. "Helen, this is criminal," she whispered. "You can't just let this go." "I'm not," I replied. "But I can't just walk into his house and accuse him either. I need proof." So I began collecting it. Every email, every text message from him while I was in the hospital. Every voicemail where he'd said, "Don't worry, Mom, I've got everything handled." I even called the hospital to confirm which papers I had signed before my surgery. None of them matched the so-called power of attorney. Days passed, then weeks. I stayed quiet, pretending to be fragile and confused, just as Mark expected me to be. I let him believe his secret was safe. Meanwhile, I was digging deeper. One evening, while looking through old documents in my sister's attic, I found something strange. A sealed envelope with my name scrawled on it in my late husband's handwriting. Inside was our original house deed, along with a handwritten note. "If this house ever changes hands, it must be through your consent and yours alone. Never sign it away." Tears filled my eyes. My husband had known how much that home meant to me. Every nail, every wall, every flower in the garden carried our story. I whispered into the still air, "Dawn. Don't worry, Charles, I'll get it back." The next morning, I made a quiet visit to the notary office listed on the fake document. Carol wasn't expecting me. When she saw me standing there, her eyes widened and her smile faltered. "Mrs. Sanders, what a surprise. How are you feeling?" I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but edged with steel. "I'm feeling betrayed. You signed off on a document that sold my home, a document I never saw." She froze, color draining from her face. Mark told me." "Mark told you I was too old to understand? Too sick to notice? Tell me, Carol, how much did he pay you to look the other way?" She stammered, her hands trembling. "It wasn't like that. He said it was temporary, that you wanted him to handle your estate." Her words spilled out like a confession. That was all I needed. I left her office with my head held high. My son's lies were beginning to unravel, one thread at a time. By the time I reached my sister's house that evening, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to make him face me, in front of everyone who thought he was a hero for taking care of his poor mother. And when I did, he would finally see what it meant to betray the woman who gave him everything. The evening Helen returned from the hospital, a quiet storm brewed in her chest. The once familiar creak of her wooden porch was gone. The house, her house, stood alien now. The curtains were new, the garden bare, and a foreign car sat in the driveway. It was as if her life had been erased and overwritten by strangers. She stood there for several minutes, her cane trembling slightly in her grip, watching through the windows. She could see shadows, Linda, her niece, and Mark, Linda's husband, moving around inside, laughing, cooking, living. That laughter pierced Helen's heart. Just a few months ago, she'd trusted them completely. Linda had insisted she'd handle her bills while Helen was hospitalized, told her not to worry about paperwork or signatures. "You just get better, Auntie," she'd said, voice syrupy sweet. But now, Helen knew better. Her loving niece had forged her name and sold the home she had built with her late husband's hands. But Helen was no fool. She didn't storm in. She didn't shout. She planned. For 3 sleepless nights, she sat in her friend Grace's tiny kitchen, sketching out her next moves on scraps of old envelopes. She might have been old, but she had the mind of a chess player. Linda thought she'd stolen from a fragile, naive woman. What she didn't know was that Helen had been quietly recording conversations, saving documents, and keeping every letter that came through the mail during her hospital stay. Every lie Linda told was written somewhere. By the 4th night, Helen had called an old acquaintance, Detective Carson, a man she hadn't spoken to since her husband's passing. Carson was retired now, but when Helen told him what happened, his voice sharpened like a blade. "You've still got fight in you, Helen," he said. "I've got more than fight," she replied. "I've got proof." They met in secret at a local diner, far from Linda's neighborhood. Helen wore a plain gray coat and a scarf that hid her face. The smell of burnt coffee and bacon hung in the air as she laid out her evidence, copies of her will, notarized bank records, and the suspicious transfer of ownership dated the exact week she was sedated for surgery. Carson whistled low. "This isn't just betrayal," he muttered. "This is felony-level fraud." But Helen wasn't satisfied with justice alone. She wanted truth, exposed, undeniable, and public. She wanted Linda to feel the same helplessness she had felt lying in that hospital bed, unable to move, wondering why her family didn't visit. So she proposed something bold, a dinner. 2 days later, Helen called Linda, masking her voice with fragile warmth. "Linda, darling, I'm feeling so much better. I'd love to see you. Maybe we could have dinner." "Just like old times?" There was a brief pause on the other end, hesitation, but greed spoke louder than guilt. "Of course, Aunt Helen," Linda replied quickly. "We've missed you." Helen smiled, though her heart pounded hard enough to feel it in her throat. The trap was set. The night of the dinner, she arrived early, accompanied by Grace, who pretended to be her nurse. Grace carried a small handbag, but inside it wasn't medication. It was a tiny voice recorder and a USB drive with copies of every incriminating file Helen had. Linda welcomed them at the door, wearing pearls Helen recognized as her own. "Oh, Aunt Helen, you look wonderful. You shouldn't have come all this way." "Oh, it wasn't far," Helen said sweetly, her eyes gliding over the new furniture. "After all, this place used to be so familiar." Linda laughed nervously and motioned them in. Mark stood by the kitchen counter, holding a glass of wine, looking smug and relaxed. But when Helen's sharp eyes met his, something flickered. Fear, maybe recognition that this wasn't just a visit. Dinner began. Every bite felt heavy, every smile fake. The air was so thick with tension that even the ticking of the wall clock sounded accusing. Helen waited until the right moment, after dessert, when wine had loosened tongues and Linda was bragging about her new investment, before she leaned forward, her tone quiet but cutting. "Linda, do you remember when you promised to take care of my home papers while I was in the hospital?" "Of course," Linda said quickly. "I handled everything for you. You were too weak to notice you sold my house?" Helen interrupted, her voice cold as winter steel. Linda froze. The color drained from her face. Mark shifted uncomfortably. What are you talking about? That's ridiculous." "Then perhaps you'll explain," Helen said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were the copies. See, on-tracks, transfers, and the forged signature, all in black and white. Mark's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. For several seconds no one spoke. The only sound was the faint click of Grace's hidden recorder. Then Helen leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper. "You thought you could take everything from me while I was too sick to fight back, but I remember every word you said. And so does the law." Mark tried to recover, sputtering excuses about clerical errors and temporary transfers, but Linda was trembling now. Her mask had cracked. "You can't prove anything," she snapped, her voice rising. Helen smiled, slow, deliberate. "Actually," she said, "I already did." At that exact moment, Carson entered through the back door. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain coat, but the authority in his voice was unmistakable. "Evening, folks. I believe we have some unfinished business." Linda gasped. Mark went pale. Grace turned off the recorder. Helen stood, her hand steady for the first time in weeks. "I told you I had one last surprise." What happened after that would echo through the town for months. Helen didn't just expose her niece's crime, she made sure every neighbor, every friend, and every person who'd once pitied her knew the truth. Her story hit the local news as elderly woman outsmarts family in property scam. And though the victory didn't bring her husband back or erase the betrayal, it gave her something far more powerful: closure. That night, as police cars flashed red and blue outside what was once her home, Helen stood on the porch, and whispered to the wind, "You took my house, but you'll never take my peace again." The next morning, sunlight spilled across the quiet neighborhood, but it couldn't soften the memory of the previous night. Helen sat by Grace's kitchen window, the police cruiser lights still flickering faintly in her mind. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache. She'd done what she had to do. She had fought back. But victory didn't feel sweet. It felt heavy. Her niece, Linda, was in police custody. Mark had been taken in for questioning. The forged documents, the bank transfers, the phone recordings, everything was now evidence. Helen's home was sealed off for investigation, its front yard crowded with curious neighbors. Some whispered about her bravery, others about Linda's greed. But Helen didn't care what they said. She only wanted silence, the kind of silence that lets a person finally breathe after months of deceit. She reached for her tea. Her hand trembled slightly. "Justice," she whispered. But the word didn't comfort her. It wasn't justice she'd wanted most. It was honesty, and that was something she could never get back. The news spread like wildfire through the town. Elderly widow outsmarts niece in property fraud. Reporters wanted interviews. A local TV host called, asking her to share her inspiring story. But Helen refused. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to heal. Grace, ever the loyal friend, fussed around the kitchen, trying to distract her. "You did the right thing, Helen," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "People like them, they think kindness is weakness. You showed them it's not." Helen nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the teacup. "It's strange," she murmured. "When I saw her in handcuffs, I didn't feel proud. I just felt tired. Like something in me broke too." Grace sat across from her. "That's what betrayal does. It doesn't just steal your trust, it steals your peace." 2 weeks later, Helen was called to court for a preliminary hearing. She walked slowly into the courthouse, her cane clicking softly on the marble floor. The air inside smelled of paper, old wood, and judgment. When she entered the courtroom, her breath caught. There was Linda, hair messy, eyes red, her once confident smile replaced by fear. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that fleeting second, Anne didn't see a criminal. She saw the little girl she used to babysit, the one who used to run barefoot through her garden, giggling and chasing butterflies. The prosecutor's voice broke her trance. "Mrs. Campbell, can you confirm that this is your signature on the sale document?" "No," Helen said firmly. "That's her handwriting, not mine." Her voice didn't shake once. The room was silent except for the scratch of pens. Linda's lawyer tried to argue that she was acting in Helen's best interest, claiming confusion and temporary authorization, but Carson's evidence dismantled every excuse. The emails, the recordings, the bank trail, they painted a clear picture of greed wrapped in affection. When the judge spoke, his tone was sharp. Forgery, exploitation, and financial abuse of an elder. These are not misunderstandings, Miss Reynolds. These are crimes. Helen didn't look away. She didn't smile. She simply whispered under her breath, "I trusted you." That night, back at Grace's home, Helen sat by the fireplace. The house smelled of lavender and old books. She stared into the flames, remembering her late husband's face. "You always said I was too soft," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Maybe you were right, but softness saved me. It's what made me human, not like them." The door creaked open. Grace entered with 2 cups of cocoa. "They'll get what they deserve," she said. "You just focus on getting your life back." Helen smiled faintly. "Life?" she echoed. "Funny how it can feel so fragile, even when you survive." Grace looked at her kindly. "What will you do now?" Helen didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire, watching the wood crackle and turn to ash. "Maybe start over," she said finally, "but not with a new house. With a new kind of peace." The following month brought slow changes. The court officially restored the property to Helen's name. She was offered compensation for emotional damages, though she cared little for the money. The house itself felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories. Every room still echoed with laughter that had turned out to be lies. So instead of moving back in, Helen made a different choice. She donated the house to a women's recovery shelter, a place where single mothers and widows could find safety. The same walls that once held betrayal would now hold hope. When the social worker asked why, Helen smiled softly. "Because a home should never be built on deceit. Let it become something better." The woman hugged her, tears in her eyes. That evening, Helen and Grace stood outside the old house one last time. The windows glowed with new life. Laughter, children, warmth. "Looks better already," Grace said. Helen nodded. "I thought revenge would make me feel strong, but letting go, that's what made me free." Weeks passed, then months. Linda's trial moved forward, and though Helen attended each hearing, she stopped feeling the old anger. She listened to the testimonies, watched the verdict unfold, guilty on all counts, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the air smelled like spring. The world was moving on, and so would she. One afternoon, she sat on a park bench, sketching quietly in a worn notebook. A little girl nearby was feeding pigeons with her grandmother. Helen smiled. The sight reminded her of her younger days, before greed, before betrayal. Grace joined her with coffee and said, "You know, you could write a book about this." Helen chuckled softly. "Maybe I already am." She turned the notebook around. On the first page were written 5 words, underlined twice. "They thought they took everything." Then below it, "But I was never just my house." That night, Helen wrote a letter, not to Linda, not to the court, but to her younger self. "Dear Helen, you were kind, you were trusting, and they mistook that for weakness, but you were never weak. You survived betrayal, illness, and loss, and still chose forgiveness. That's power. The world may take you, or home, your money, even your peace for a time, but it can never take your dignity unless you hand it over. You didn't lose, Helen. You learned." She folded the letter, placed it inside her journal, and smiled. The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, the moon hung high, silent, silver, watching over her like an old friend. For the first time in years, Helen felt light, not because she'd won, but because she'd ended it. The lies, the fear, the shadows. Tomorrow would come, and when it did, she'd be ready, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a woman who had finally reclaimed her own story. The prison visitation room was colder than Helen expected. The walls were painted a dull gray, and the fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. She'd debated coming for weeks. Her lawyer, her friends, even Grace had warned her not to. "You owe her nothing," Grace had said. But deep inside, Helen knew she wasn't there for Linda's sake. She was there for her own. A guard motioned her forward. "Mrs. Campbell, she's ready for you." Helen's cane clicked against the floor as she followed him to the partitioned booth. When she sat down, her reflection blurred on the scratched glass. Then Linda appeared on the other side, thinner, paler, her once perfectly styled hair hanging limp around her face. She looked older, not just from prison life, but from guilt. For a moment, neither woman spoke. "You came," Linda whispered finally, her voice cracking. Helen's gaze didn't waver. "I said I would, didn't I?" Linda laughed weakly, though it came out as a cough. "I didn't think you'd actually do it. Not after everything." Helen folded her hands. "After everything. Maybe I needed to see the person who sold my home while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed." Linda looked down, tears welling. "I was desperate. You don't understand. Mark said. Helen cut her off, her tone sharp. "You were an adult, Linda. No one forged my signature but you." Linda pressed her palms against the glass, trembling. "I thought you'd forgive me. You always forgave everyone." Helen's expression softened just slightly. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending it never happened." There was a long silence. Somewhere down the hallway, a door slammed. The echo lingered, like a warning. "Do you hate me?" Linda asked quietly. Helen hesitated. "No," she said finally, "but I don't recognize you anymore. The girl I knew loved books, kindness and family. The woman sitting in front of me, she traded all that for money." Tears spilled down Linda's cheeks. "I was scared, Aunt Helen. Mark was threatening to leave me if I didn't fix our debts. He said the house was just sitting there. I thought," Helen raised a hand, stopping her. "You thought wrong. You thought kindness was weakness. You thought love was a tool." Linda's voice cracked. "I ruined everything, didn't I?" Helen nodded slowly. "You did, but that's something you have to live with now." After their conversation, Helen left the prison feeling heavier, yet strangely lighter. Closure didn't always come wrapped in satisfaction. Sometimes, it came wrapped in grief. As she stepped outside, the winter air bit at her cheeks. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the gray sky. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold sting her awake. "You did it," she whispered to herself. "It's over." But deep down, she knew healing wasn't about endings. It was about acceptance. In the weeks that followed, Helen threw herself into rebuilding a different kind of life. She began volunteering twice a week at the same women's shelter she'd donated her house to. The first time she walked in, she was greeted by a young mother named Clara, eyes tired, but hopeful. "You're the lady who gave us this place," Clara said, her voice trembling. Helen smiled gently. "No, dear, I just gave back what was taken from me. You're the ones giving it purpose." She spent her afternoons reading stories to children, sewing blankets, and teaching budgeting skills to women trying to regain control of their lives. Each act of kindness filled the cracks that betrayal had left in her soul. The women admired her, not because she was wealthy or brave, but because she was living proof that loss could be turned into light. One rainy afternoon, Grace visited her at the shelter, umbrella in hand. "You know," Grace said, "you could have chosen to move far away, forget all this, but you stayed." Helen smiled, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Running doesn't heal anything. Staying does." Grace looked around at the busy room, women folding laundry, laughter echoing from the kitchen, children drawing on the floor. "You turned your pain into a place of healing," she said. "That's rare." Helen chuckled softly. "Maybe, or maybe I just refused to let my story end in bitterness." Meanwhile, in prison, Linda's life changed in ways she'd never imagined. Her once privileged habits, fine dining, luxury perfumes, and social media perfection, were replaced by 5 a.m. wake-ups, cold meals, and silence. She had been sentenced to 5 years for fraud, 2 for elder exploitation. The first months were unbearable. She cried herself to sleep, haunted by Helen's calm, steady voice during their last meeting. But somewhere in that emptiness, something began to shift. She started attending literacy sessions, helping other inmates write letters to their families. For the first time in her adult life, she began to understand the weight of empathy, the same empathy she had taken for granted in her aunt. One day, her counselor handed her a blank journal. "Write down what you wish you could say to her," he suggested. That night, Linda wrote a letter, not to beg, not to excuse, but to confess. "Dear Aunt Helen, I used to think your kindness made you naive. Now I know it made you strong, the kind of strength I never had. I see now that love without respect is nothing. I took what wasn't mine because I thought you'd never fight back. But you did, not with anger, but with dignity, and that's what broke me the most. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but I promise I'll never take goodness for granted again." When she finished, she didn't send it. She simply folded the letter and kept it under her pillow. Months later, Helen received a package in the mail. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. No note, just the bird. Grace saw it and frowned. "From her?" Helen nodded. "I think so." She turned it over in her hands. Rough, imperfect, yet made with care. Something in her chest loosened. "What will you do with it?" Grace asked. Helen smiled faintly. "Keep it. Maybe people can change. Maybe she's learning what I already knew, that guilt can destroy, but it can also rebuild." That night, Helen placed the bird on her bedside table, beside a framed photo of her late husband. The house felt quiet, but peaceful. She opened her window, letting the cool wind brush against her face. "It's strange," she whispered to the night. "You lose everything, a house, a family, your trust, and yet, somehow, you gain something deeper." She looked at the stars, her voice steady. "You gain yourself." The clock ticked softly. Outside, an owl hooted, a small sound of life continuing, no matter what had been lost. Helen closed her eyes, finally at ease. The world hadn't been kind to her, but she had learned something profound. Sometimes, the real victory isn't in revenge or justice, it's in peace after chaos. And for the first time in a long time, she slept. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had faced betrayal, fought back with dignity, and walked away with her soul intact. The first spring after the ordeal arrived like a slow awakening. For months, Helen had lived in a fog of lawyers, settlement letters, and aching memories, but now, the world outside was beginning to bloom again. She could smell the faint sweetness of lilacs every morning when she opened her kitchen window. Her new home was small, just 2 rooms and a garden no bigger than a parking spot, but it was hers. Every brick, every chipped teacup on the shelf, every blanket folded on the couch carried her fingerprint. For the first time in a long time, Helen didn't feel like a guest in her own life. Each morning she'd sip her tea on the porch and watch people pass by on their way to the shelter. The building, her old house, stood proudly at the end of the lane. She could see it from her window, its front porch newly painted, children's laughter spilling through the open door. It didn't belong to her anymore, but it didn't haunt her either. In fact, she often smiled when she saw it, because it was still alive, doing something good. Grace called it her miracle of mercy. "You turned the very weapon they used against you into a refuge for others," she'd said one day. Helen simply replied, "Maybe that's what it was meant to be all along." One morning, as she was trimming the overgrown vines by her gate, a familiar face appeared at the corner. A tall woman in a dark coat, holding the hand of a little boy. Helen froze, scissors halfway to the leaves. Linda. Her niece looked fragile. The confident, sharp-voiced woman she once knew had vanished. In her place stood someone quieter, humbler. The boy beside her clutched a small paper bag, his curious eyes darting between them. "Aunt Helen," Linda began softly, "I wasn't sure if I should come." Helen stood there for a long moment searching Linda's face. She could see traces of guilt still lingering, but also sincerity. "Why are you here?" Helen asked finally. Linda took a breath. "To thank you for the letter." "The letter?" Linda nodded. "You sent me one, months ago. It just said, 'I hope you find peace.' I didn't deserve that, but it gave me something to hold on to." Helen looked away, her throat tightening. "I wasn't sure. To whoever reads this after I'm gone, this is the story of my house, my mistake, and my redemption. I once believed losing everything meant the end, but it wasn't. It was a beginning I didn't expect. They thought they took my home, but what they really gave me was a second chance to see what truly matters." She paused, looking out the window at the shelter lights glowing in the distance. Then she smiled and continued, "If you ever lose something precious, remember, maybe it's not gone. Maybe it's just being turned into something you can't see yet. something better. She closed the notebook and sealed it in an envelope labeled, "For the next owner." That was her last surprise. Not money, not revenge, but a message of resilience that would outlive her. Years later, after Helen passed peacefully in her sleep, Grace found the envelope and delivered it to the new manager of the shelter. They framed her words and hung them by the entrance. Every person who walked in, battered, lost, or hopeless, would read them, and in that quiet, golden handwriting, they would see themselves reflected. "They thought they took my home, but I built something they could never destroy." And that was Helen's true victory. Not the court case, not the settlement, not even Linda's apology. Her victory was the light she left behind, the warmth that turned betrayal into shelter, pain into purpose, loss into legacy. In the end, she had no mansion, no riches, no family portrait on the wall, but she had something far rarer: peace. The day the shelter held its memorial for Helen, the sky hung heavy with soft gray clouds. It wasn't raining, but the air felt full, like the earth itself was holding back tears. Grace stood by the front porch of the shelter, her hands trembling slightly as she pinned a photo of Helen on the wall beside the door. In the picture, Helen was sitting on that same porch, a gentle smile, teacup in hand, sunlight on her silver hair. Beneath the photo, Grace placed a simple brass plate engraved with 6 words. She turned loss into a home. People began to gather: families, volunteers, strangers who'd once arrived here broken and left a little less so. Some brought flowers, others brought notes, folded carefully, tucked into the cracks of the old wooden railing. Inside, the shelter buzzed with quiet emotion. Laughter mixed with tears. A few children ran around, unaware of the solemn tone, and perhaps Helen would have liked that best. Grace stepped to the front, holding a small notebook, the same one Helen had left behind. The one with her words about beginnings hidden in endings. "I don't think Helen ever realized," Grace began softly, her voice echoing through the room, "just how many people she changed. She didn't preach, she didn't lecture, she just lived, and through her pain, she gave this place life." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, eyes glistening. Grace turned the page, reading aloud from Helen's final entry. "You can survive being forgotten, but you cannot survive forgetting your own kindness." The room went still. Not a breath moved. Grace closed the notebook gently. That's who she was. Even when everything was taken from her, her home, her trust, her family, she kept her kindness. And that's what built these walls. At the back of the room, Linda sat with her son, David, now 10 years old. He clutched a small clay heart, the same one he'd once given Helen. Its blue glaze had faded, but the words were still clear. When Grace invited anyone to speak, Linda rose slowly. She hesitated. People still recognized her face, and the old shame flickered for a second. But then she saw the photograph of her aunt on the wall. That gentle smile, it didn't judge her. It invited her. Linda stepped forward. "I once called her weak," she began, her voice trembling. "I thought kindness made her blind. I thought I could take what was hers and it wouldn't matter. But I was wrong. Because even after I hurt her, she still sent me love. She sent me peace." Her eyes glistened as she looked toward the photo. "Aunt Helen, I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know, your home didn't die. It's still saving people. And your light, it found me too." She placed the clay heart beneath the brass plate, her tears falling freely now. "Thank you," she whispered. The room was silent. No one clapped. No one spoke. They didn't need to. That silence was the applause. Months passed, and the shelter continued to thrive. Word spread about Helen's story, not through newspapers or television, but through whispers. Through the people she touched. A woman who'd once slept on the streets found shelter there and later became a volunteer herself. A young man recovering from addiction painted the porch and wrote hope across the steps. A local carpenter donated new beds, saying, "I never met her, but I feel like I know her." And one day, a filmmaker from a nearby town arrived, asking Grace if he could make a short documentary about Helen. "It's not about fame," he said. "It's about legacy. People need to see what kindness can do when the world is cruel." Grace agreed. When the short film aired online months later, titled "The House That Forgiveness Built," it quietly went viral. Comments poured in. thousands of strangers writing how they'd been betrayed, hurt, forgotten, and yet, somehow, Helen's story reminded them to keep their humanity. I cried. She reminded me of my grandmother. I needed this today. The comment section became its own kind of shelter. Words holding words, strangers comforting strangers, and in every frame of that video, Helen's soft smile, her garden, the light on her window, her spirit seemed to whisper through the screen, "Don't let bitterness win." Years later, David, now grown, returned to the shelter with his mother. It was bigger now, expanded, painted bright white, with a new sign that read, "Helen's Haven." He walked through the halls quietly, touching the walls, the tables, the photos of families who'd passed through. In the main hallway hung a large mural, painted by volunteers, showing Helen sitting beneath a tree, surrounded by people of all ages and colors, smiling. Above her, written in soft golden letters, "Kindness is the home we all belong to." Linda stood beside her son, tears welling in her eyes. "She'd be proud," she said. David nodded. "I think she's still here." He turned toward the garden outside, the same one Helen once tended. There, among the lilacs and ivy, a single blue flower swayed in the wind. David smiled. "See, she never left." That night, as the shelter lights glowed softly against the dusk, a gentle rain began to fall. Not cold, but warm, cleansing. It touched every leaf, every brick, every corner of the house that once symbolized betrayal, now reborn as sanctuary. And somewhere, in the echo of the rain, it was as if a voice whispered, "They thought they took my home, but they only gave me the world."